this goes back to that saying about emotions, is that if we don't tolerate feeling bad and we think, okay, I need to be happy all the time, we're ignoring what something like sadness is actually telling us, and what melancholy is telling us, and what it is to try to help us understand the situation. And so the idea of like, what does mentally healthy and mentally well people look like, it doesn't mean that we don't have emotions, and it doesn't mean that we don't have good days or bad days. It means that we're able to take that to better understand ourselves and say, okay, how do I want to engage in life? How do I want to move forward?
Hey everybody, I'm not going to lie, and I feel weird saying this, but Dr. Tkach is one of my favorite people to talk to on this podcast. He was the very first person we had on this podcast, and we talk about this a little bit, but I had this huge plan for One Whole Life Media, and he essentially took my 2 years of planning and tore it to shreds and then put it in his mouth and spit it in my face. I was like, dude, you know how long I've been working on this? And he's like, I don't care. Depression is just a collection of symptoms. You're not going to find it anywhere. And it was actually one of the most helpful things that ever happened. So I invited him back, one, to thank him for that, and then to ask more questions. And we talked about things like how to find a good clinician, like what are the steps people have to go through, ways to potentially avoid the nightmare of waiting 3 months to get in with somebody, or why we even have to wait 3 months to talk to somebody, or what can we do in the meantime while we're trying to get help, or how to find a good therapist, one that fits us, so we don't see them for 4 or 5 sessions and then go, oh, this isn't the right person, I don't like therapy, and then you go try and find somebody else, or maybe those people don't find somebody ever at all, and that's a huge problem. And then I'm still genuinely curious about trauma, where it comes from and what it looks like, and he had this really cool perspective on it as like a flash bulb. But we get into all of that in this podcast, and as always, Dr. Tkach is bringing up philosophers, and he explains things so simply because he's been teaching for a long time. And I appreciate that, because some of these concepts are hard to bite on right off the bat. So, without further ado, Dr. Awesome. Confucius said we have 2 lives, and the second begins when we realize that we only have one. We're all given one whole life. And when we find and break the barriers that are preventing us from living fully, we have an audacious attempt to improve mental health. One Whole Life with Sean Francis. Well, we could just start this thing if you want, and then we
let's jump on
it.
it.
Let's just do it before we start, before we go down some tangents or rabbit holes. Yeah, you were just saying you went back to practicing because there's been a need for it. And from my experience, I've seen the same thing where, not just me personally, but I had like a friend a few years ago who reached out and goes, hey, I need some help. I'm suicidal. What do I do? And we went out to try to get help. And then they were like, okay, well, it's going to be 3 to 6 months before we can kick you in or get you in. And you can start these meds, but they're going to take some time too to maybe start showing some results. So like what do you do as a clinician and as somebody who's working in these hospital settings to help somebody like that? And do you see the system improving, or how can people, there's a lot of questions to uncover here, but like what can people do essentially is the question in this situation.
Yeah, so the first thing to kind of understand is the healthcare ecosystem and why we're in this situation right now. And part of what happens there is a overall shortage of clinicians. So there's been some bottlenecks that move back quite a bit a ways. And historically, there hasn't always been parity with healthcare plans about paying for mental health and physical health, which would deter some people from getting the mental health support that they needed. Once there became more parity there, the need for mental health clinicians increased. We also got better at identifying mental health and how it contributed to overall physical health and other areas, and just what that benefit is. And so through that, there's been greater utilization of mental health resources, and it's expanding at a rate that is outpacing new clinicians entering into the field, replacing retiring clinicians, so on and so forth. So what you're seeing is in a lot of places, there's this shortage. And what that does is it creates this wait time, this lag time, where there's people that really need to get in, and they've got to wait for capacity to open up with our clinicians. The thing that we're also starting to see is the way that clinicians were historically either paid or their expectation for performance, certain places are going for payment based off of what percentage of capacity are you at full. So it's been pushing clinicians to say, do more, do more, do more, which helps those wait times go down. But then on the back end of it increases the likelihood of burnout and people needing to take time off and away and either exiting the field or looking for other types of places to work, other types of fields to go into. And so all of that creates this pressure cooker. And then you've got this system where we're trying to be ready and able to help support people. There's a lack of clinicians, there's a lot of pressure to move people in and get them in, and there's not always the capacity there. So then we're left with gaps. So there's a couple of things that happen is we need better triaging processes. So once somebody comes in and starts working with a clinician, they may start off at a highly elevated state and they may have some ups and downs, but over time they're going to start showing improvement, hopefully.
Yeah.
And likewise with medications, there takes some time for the medications to start, as you mentioned, but then they're going to start seeing some improvement. Now, as a clinician, we want to continue with that progress. And we need to figure out then how do we sustain that, but then potentially make room for somebody else to come in who's at higher acuity level.
Yeah.
And that becomes a challenge because you don't want to push somebody faster than they're ready or step them down to make room for somebody else who needs to sooner than they're ready, because then we run into the risk that they're going to go ahead and spike in acuity and now they're back needing more help, and you only have so much capacity, so many hours that you can fill with clinical work. So it creates this balancing act of how do you read the room and say, this is the right progression for our clients that I'm already working with in order to make room for new. And so it creates this bottleneck effect. So the whole triage process in the beginning tends to be first come, first serve, unless there's a crisis situation, in which then there tends to be an escalation and potentially somebody gets in sooner. We also run into the problem though is that when somebody puts their name, they pull their ticket, they get in queue, they get in line and whatnot to wait to be seen. During that time, they may escalate in acuity,
Yeah.
or they may also start to naturally kind of decrease depending on if it's a situational or time-based stressor. Think about most people's moods and you say, okay, 3 to 6 months from now, I'm going to get in. What's your mood going to be like in 3 to 6 months?
Or three to
It,
6 hours for some people too, like it gets
oh,
insane.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so you've got this kind of wide continuum of what happens. And so when people then go into crisis, a lot of counties have mobile crisis units where they can go ahead and dispatch people to either meet you, especially if you're in kind of more of an urban area where there's a greater concentration of resources, or throughout the US, we have like the Suicide Prevention Lifeline and other types of resources that are there. Now, some of those are connected with other resources that they can then funnel in. But a lot of times, what happens is there's a handoff. All right, you've been seen at the hospital. Here are some resources of places you can go, call them to get in, and then down the waiting game until
Yeah.
somebody's available. And what that does is it creates this gap while people are in this holding pattern to get in. During that time, they might then go back and use more crisis resources, or they may get disillusioned by the whole healthcare process and say, I don't know what else to do. I tried, I can't get in. And they may then opt not to pursue it, which is not what we want. It's not the experience.
Yeah, and if I can speak in just a little, and that's been a little bit of my experience being in the system since I was 10 years old, where it took a really years and years and years to find, oh, there's that therapist that actually helped, or I realized it wasn't the meds. It was, for me personally, it was uncovering some of these traumatic experiences and navigating patterns that created those and feeling better that way. But it almost, it feels like now even still to go, how long do you stay in a system before you go, there's got to be some other way, or is this even worth it anymore with the money situation and then the time and then maybe finding a new doctor? And it's just, is the system, do you see it improving at all, or are there Or does it just need to adapt and grow in a different ways? Does education need to be presented sooner? Do we need to teach people mental health skills at a younger age to maybe present the amount, of people?
It,
These tough questions, probably.
it is, but the answer is pretty much yes, 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 yes,
Yeah.
yes, and it depends. And
Yeah.
so where we start looking at this is this whole continuum. Let's kind of break it down to a person's experience.
Yeah.
So let's say I'm in crisis and
Mm.
I'm reaching out, and suddenly, it's maybe a mobile crisis center or some type of person who's triaging to say, okay, go meet with this person. I go there, and my first experience, my first interaction is going to determine a lot of how I feel about the mental health field.
Right.
If it feels very welcoming, if I feel like this person is invested in really trying to figure me out and help me, and I have faith in that person's genuineness that they want to help, I'm going to continue to engage because I'm going to trust the system. If instead I feel like, okay, I'm overworked, I'm burdened, let's go ahead, get you through this, and then I'll get you either assigned to somebody else and whatnot. And I feel like I'm just being pushed along like I'm at the DMV.
Yeah.
Um, no offense to the DMV, but
Yeah.
if that's how I feel, rather than a caring, experience, my likelihood and my enthusiasm to engage is going to be a lot lower, and my trust in the system is going to be a lot lower. And from there, any other type of handoff or stop or misstep is going to be just another check on that list before I disengage and I stop
Yeah.
pursuing treatment. And once people have written off treatment, that's where it's a place where it's going to be really hard to get them to regain that trust, or for most people to re-engage.
Yeah.
And so that first point of entry is extremely important. And the other thing is that, well, as you mentioned, mental health education. What most people don't probably realize is that aside from acute care, like if it's an emergency situation, it's pretty much you're going to get matched with who you can because it's an acute situation and we just need to get you care as fast as possible. But when you start going for longer term care, one of the things that's most important, there's a couple of factors that play in that determine the overall success rate and outcome. And one of the larger factors is how much you feel your clinician that you're working with trusts you and you trust them, mostly like how you trust them rather than if they trust you. And you believe that they want your best interest in mind and you feel connected. And if you feel that sense of connection, like they care for me, they're invested in trying to help me, and I trust that therapeutic relationship, my likelihood of success for treatment is a lot higher. So that match, do I feel comfortable working with the person I'm assigned to? Do I like the clinician? Do I think that they have my best interest in mind? These are questions that we should ask ourselves. And if the answer is no, what not a lot of people are taught or understand is that you have a right to ask, can you help me find another clinician that matches?
Mm.
Now, clinicians are all trained that that therapeutic match is extremely important. And so if somebody asks me, hey, I would much rather work with somebody that is like X, we're all trained not to take that personally. I shouldn't be there saying, let me convince you otherwise. And oh, don't, like I'm feeling rejected and all that. Like we all know that thing, you can't force a therapeutic connection. You can both work on it. And there are going to be times maybe that there's things we call therapeutic ruptures. Clinicians sometimes make missteps. But if you can acknowledge it and own it as a clinician and work to fix it, what you're still showing is that you're invested in the therapeutic relationship and that builds that trust.
So that's got to
But
be hard, though. Especially, I mean, as a clinician,
yeah,
I couldn't even imagine having somebody come in with all these guards up already to a stranger and going, I'm gonna open up and be vulnerable to this person and try and get them to trust me somehow. And I'm sure there's classes and things you guys do to help with that, but that just sounds like a task in and of itself that would be extremely hard.
it is if you take it personally as a challenge. So for
Okay.
me, I did a lot of mental health court ordered individuals that had to go to treatment, that had to go to therapy. And one of the things, I had a phenomenal mentor, and one of the things that he taught me right off the bat was nobody is going to trust you because you tell them they need to trust you.
Right.
You have to earn it. You have to be able to be there. So when I start and I do my intake with clients, one of the first things I tell them, I say, I'm going to ask you this first intake. It's going to be asking you a lot of questions. Most of my therapy sessions aren't like this. It's more conversational. But let me set the stage so you know that this first one is a lot of questions. If I ask you anything that you don't want to answer, you don't have to. If you ever want to know why I'm asking, let me know because there's a therapeutic reason behind it, and you have a right to know why I'm asking that question. But that key thing, that first part, if you don't want to answer, you do not have to. For me, I think that's an important part because if I say you have to answer me, I'm taking away your autonomy and your choice, and I'm saying you must trust me. And the reality is I can say that because the expectation is, yes, I need answers and I need accuracy and information in order to do my job as a clinician. But there is never any type of expectation or rule that you or that anybody as a patient has to give me that information. I'm not entitled to it.
Right.
If you don't trust me and aren't comfortable with me, human nature says that you're going to either be guarded, you're going to not answer, you're not going to engage, and you're not going to share it. And so I always work to empower my patients to say, only answer what you're comfortable with.
Mm.
And then how do we build that trust that if you aren't comfortable answering, do you feel okay telling me I don't want to answer that? You don't have to, but if we
Yeah.
can get to that place, that's a victory because that's saying you at least trust me enough to set up a boundary to say, I don't want to do this. And I'm going to respect that. And then we can start working together and build from there. And this is when we've talked about trauma and whatnot, this is one of the issues that I think is a major stumbling block for a lot of clinicians when they start working with trauma. There's specialized training people need to go through if you're going to start processing trauma with clients. And one of them is that you really have to know yourself.
Okay.
So I've taught at a graduate level with teaching clinicians, and one of the things that's a red flag is when somebody wants to be the person to solve somebody else's trauma for them.
Mm.
And it sounds kind of counterintuitive. As clinicians, yes, you're there to try to help. But the saying I always gave to my students, and that I always practice from as well, is you should only ever be a supporting character in the movie of therapy. You should never be
Yeah.
the star.
Yeah.
And the moment you try to be like, oh, I got this person to trust me and they opened up and look how great of a clinician I am,
Mm.
you are at great risk of doing damage. Because the biggest thing with trauma that happens is when we try to get people to share stuff before they're comfortable with it, if they don't feel safe doing that, you're technically taking the power away from the client and you can re-traumatize them. That whole
Yeah.
therapy situation can then go from being something that's a positive to I felt like I had to share my story and I wasn't ready yet.
Wow. It's a really
And
beautiful. It's changed the perspective I look at therapists now. Having that, I've kind of taken a similar approach with coaching. I know, I mean, that's kind of my
yeah,
world, but where you go, I don't care how high you jump or who helps you get to your goals or whatever you want to do with the sport, but I'm a sidekick, right? I'm here just to
yes,
help you get there. Yeah, and I'll push you to whoever needs to go, which is the exact same thing you're saying in a way. But it took a while to get there, right? And do you find that happens with a lot of therapists too? Like they kind of
oh,
get there eventually over time where they come in gung ho ready to like save the world and then they go, okay, I'm just here to help, or do they not have that approach when they start?
it, it all depends.
Okay.
And so some people get there and some people don't. It depends on the amount of self-reflection somebody goes through, the quality of their supervision and consultation. We should be asking ourselves, am I staying grounded? Because at any time people can get kind of off track and think, okay, I'm going to use this because I feel good about my work. And suddenly
Yeah.
it starts feeding into you. And then before you know it, people start crossing lines and it's hard. You gotta keep yourself in check. Um, the there is a French psychoanalyst. His name was Jacques Lacan, and he was this guy that liked to create controversy for the sake of kind of getting conversations started.
Yeah.
But
Sounds like
he
the
would,
world we live in today, right?
but he had some interesting ideas. He was a neo-Freudian. He followed Freud and all that, and he had this idea. He threw it out there when he was lecturing. He's like, as a clinician, you should not care whether your patient is getting better or worse. And everybody shocked and gasped and whatnot. But it grabbed the attention. And then he dug in. The reason is the moment you start saying, I need this person to get better, I need this person, it's about you. You're
Mm.
not being present as a clinician. You're not saying, I'm with this person where they're at right now. You're setting an agenda. And what happens is when you're working with a clinician and you're a patient and you realize this person wants me to get better, it starts feeling like a expectation. I need to get better for them so that they feel that they're doing their job well. And I've had a lot of clinicians come back and say, no, that doesn't come off. Patients don't do this. And I usually turn it back around on them and I say, okay, the last time you've gone to the dentist and that dental hygienist, not even the dentist,
Yeah.
asked you how often you're flossing. It's like, what is your answer? Do
Yeah.
you kick
200
in like,
times in the last day.
right, exactly, your
Yeah.
gums are bleeding and it's like, I've been great. It's because we have this natural tendency that when somebody in a helping profession, they automatically have a position of authority. They're the person, even as the dental hygienist or the dentist or anybody like that. We are kind of primed to respect that idea that they're there to help. And because of that, we want to go ahead and do our part because we're all conditioned, most of us, to want to get like the good passing grade, get the star and all that other stuff. So when we get asked those questions, we want to present in a certain type of a way. And so if we're picking up that our clinician wants us to be at a certain spot, oh, I'm going to let them down if I tell them what I'm going through. Suddenly you get people that kind of hide what they're going through and they start feeling alone.
Yeah.
When I was working in substance use treatment, one of the things that would happen a lot is that I would work with patients that were struggling with triggers and urges to return to use. And there would be this either shame or these feelings of like, I can't share that because it makes it look like I'm not progressing. And they try to hide it. And then all of a sudden you have a return to use event and whatnot. And what I would work with everybody is like, let's just meet you where you're at. If you're having those, there's nothing to be ashamed or embarrassed. Let's talk about it and then actually figure out a plan around it. And what you can do is you can actually then address it. It's if they're trying to make me feel good about their progress, they're trying to make me the star of the movie. And I can't
Mm.
do that. I got to be the supporting character. It has to be all
Right.
about the person that's there. And that's where we really look at the mental health field and we say, okay, when we've got these people in there, if somebody's a clinician and they're burnt out and they're just like, I need a win, you start putting that pressure on your clients and you start putting it there, and that's not the right place to put it. You've got to then have good life balance. What am I doing outside of clinical work where I can have there's my success, there's my win and whatnot, and instead be there and be present for the client and meet them where they're at.
Is that
Uh,
human nature, or because I see that all over the place, or is that just our society type of thing, or do you have any thoughts on that?
so
Like why we need this crazy progression, right? Or we need these goal settings. I mean, it seems very westernized in my. I'm not, I've traveled overseas and I wasn't there long, but it just didn't seem like they were talking in the same way we do. Where the next buck, the next dollar, the next height, the next thing, how to get better, how to get faster, that type of thing.
there's definitely a cultural influence that goes along with it. And there is so naturally at a core, from what we understand, there's mostly a progression towards movement forward.
Right.
So let's but that can be then amplified based off of cultural influences, and our response towards our cultural influences and how we internalize what culture tells us and our societal expectations of what we're supposed to do can really accelerate that and put really undue pressure on ourselves. And this is where I did not think I was going to be talking about Lacan a lot, but
No,
here
I'm
we're going
sorry.
to talk about Lacan.
Yeah.
Is he had this way of describing it. And other clinicians have talked about it, and there's been the ego, the super ego, and the id and whatnot. But Lacan broke it down into this basic triangle. We all have a real aspect of ourselves, what we really feel, our emotions and whatnot. And sometimes we hide that from the world. And if we suppress it too much, it comes out as our shadow, and then we're acting in a certain way. We also have an ideal idea of who we want to be. So this is what society kind of sets up as my goals, my internalized ideas of what I should be striving for. I may or may not share that with others, but it's kind of my higher expectations of what I put on myself. And then we have a social aspect. What's my persona, my personality when I'm in social settings? And that may vary. How somebody acts at work may be different than how they're acting with lifelong friends versus in a relationship versus, on the bus. Like you're going to get different aspects of self.
Yeah.
And what Lacan would say, and what a lot of psychodynamic and psychoanalytic individuals would say, is that all of those aspects are still really us. But Lacan would say if we place too much emphasis on any one of those three, if we need to be that person who is that perfect social chameleon, we ignore what we really want and we ignore how we really feel. If we place too much emphasis on the idea, what I should be, that next dollar, that next promotion, that next thing, we lose track of how do I really feel and how am I connecting with other people socially. And Lacan would say it's like having a three-legged stool and we are chopping the other ones off. You're not
Yeah.
going to have balance, you're going to fall over. And we tend to have in the dominant culture here in the US a high emphasis on that idea of aspirations, mobility. How do
Mm.
you continue to go strive and get more? And it doesn't always leave us with a sense of fulfillment because there's this kind of push.
Imbalance.
So in philosophy, one of the critiques of idealism is that there's never a sense of satisfaction. So you see this like with the French, French philosophy in the 20s before existentialism and everything else and postmodernism. There was this whole movement about idealism, and one of the major in the idealism kind of goes much further back, but there was this critique of it is that if you're always thinking about how things should be and how they can be better, there's never a moment of satisfaction. You've robbed yourself out of any
Yeah.
sense of accomplishment or satisfaction because it's never going to be enough. And we can have aspects of that to continue to drive us, but if that becomes our value, always have to strive, it will inevitably leave a sense of emptiness.
Yeah.
And this can,
I've always called that chasing infinities. I don't,
yes,
right? Like
that is a phenomenal
it
term.
never ends. Like whether it's money, whatever, anything number related is just like, oh, I got to stop chasing that. That doesn't make any sense. But yeah, that's where my brain goes immediately as you're talking about this. Is just yeah, chasing infinities, just pain, always
Well,
pain. Yeah,
it is pain because you've disconnected yourself from real. Do I even really like this? How am I feeling in the moment? Is this really who I am and really what's important to me? Or is this just this is what I've got to do because this is everybody else's belief? And this comes back to, um, you know, existentialist philosopher John Paul Sartre. Go ahead. Did not think I was going to be quoting these people, but it comes back to this thing. He had this idea of bad faith, and he used it like with religion and whatnot, but it also can be applied to other things. And it was this idea that if somebody inherited a belief system from somebody else, and they said, okay, whether it's society or others, um, and they said this is what I value because this is what I've been told and this is what makes sense and this is what everybody else is striving for, and then we pursue it, we engage in that. Sartre would say that this is bad faith because we actually haven't explored, does it really have any meaning or value for myself? Now turning that around and asking, do I actually value this myself personally, is a much more difficult question to answer because it
right.
requires us to say, I may need to step away and come up with a whole new system of what's
Yeah.
valuable to me. And it's sometimes easier to say, I'll get to it later. It's like, do you want to go out on a Friday night or do you want to take your time to say, let me really ponder, do I like going out and do I like doing this? Most people, you get after a full week and after all of this other stuff, it's sometimes just easier for people to go on that autopilot.
It's interesting you say this though, because it's almost what I've been trying to sort of do with these podcasts or talking to people or researching is get a literary analysis in a way of
Yeah.
what are they all saying that's similar You know, and you probably have those answers already. But the one that keeps popping up every single time is that awareness, like self-awareness has to be number one always. And unless you challenge me on that, which I'm totally open to because you're the expert, but
No.
it seems like that has to be there or else like what's the point of the rest of it? And as you just said, like, do these belief systems make sense? It's there, and I keep wondering, like, as kids, right? You learn your parents' belief systems, or or that's how they seem to grow up, and then your school's just society and your friends, and it kind of builds from there. And at one point, I don't know when that point is. It seems like you're faced with a choice whether you really want to dive into this and it's not comfortable or you just accept where it is and kind of go on autopilot for a while, and that's that. I mean, and let me go on to that next question then. So that with that all said, like, to you, what does that mentally healthy person look like? Like, where do they need to be? And I've fought with this a little bit because I did a year of Zen and it really stuck with me because it
Yeah.
was just pure self-awareness, right? And I kept going, I'm chasing all these goals all the time, like chasing that infinity idea. Do I need to be? I don't feel healthy when I do that. Am I okay with where I am right now? And I'm just creating suffering, I guess, as the Zen Buddhist would say. You're creating a lot of suffering in your life and you don't
Right.
need to be, right? So, like, is there a place to get to, or are we okay where we are now, or does a mentally healthy person just like where are you trying to get people to so they can operate in this society, no society, they can just be themselves? Like, what's your goal as a clinician?
Great question. And this is where that self-awareness becomes key. And so, yeah, when we talk about the progression, so first of all, actually, let's back up for a second. The
Okay.
idea clinically, when we start looking at mental health versus, when there's something clinically to address, this question comes up where we really want to think of, are symptoms or situations coming up that is preventing somebody from engaging in life the way that they want to, and that's meaningful to them. So that is an important key aspect of it.
So is that your
It's
first question you ask, like in that initial setting, just to kind of get a starting
it's
point for
along those
you as
lines.
well? Okay.
Yeah. And so, like, what do you experience? What brings you in? What would you like to see different? And how is this affecting your day-to-day life? And so, and that key, what would you like to see different? It helps tell us, like, what is getting in the way of me living life the way that I want to? Not how I think it should be or because other people want it, but how do I want that? And sometimes people don't know.
So do you
But
challenge people on that with the shoulds then? Because I hear that was a bad word when I was in the mental health hospital. Like, shoulds, that's a bad word. Don't
that,
say shoulds.
yes. So that came from the cognitive behavioral therapy movement, where there has been certain people that have really taken that and ran, where it was challenging rational logical thought. And then an offshoot of that was REP, which is emotional rational therapy, which was an offshoot of CBT. And there was this figure called Albert Ellis, and he had this saying, he's like, stop shooting all over yourself. And so, and
Like,
so
I haven't heard that one before.
yeah. So, because and we go back to like Lacan, and what they were talking about is this idea of idealizing the ideal and only chasing that. The ideal is full of shoulds. This is how I should be. This is what I should do. And if we place too much emphasis on that, all emphasis on that, we've lost track of how do I really feel, and how do I actually connect with others.
Yeah.
And that gives us a lack of balance. And so when we start thinking about, like, what does mental health and mental wellness look like, it's, are we living life the way we want to? Are we making meaningful connections to the level that we want to? Do we feel like we're doing what we actually really want to? And there are a lot of different things that can come up because of that if we're not aligned with it. And so if we go kind of a psychoanalytical approach to like things like depression, and this is where we come back to emotions. And so for me, when I'm working with people, there tends to be this value that a lot of people have in the dominant culture, where we should just muscle through our emotions, we should be able to control our emotions, and we don't want to be too emotional, and all of these shoulds.
Yeah.
And what we've done is we've kind of separated ourselves from like what's the actual function of emotions. And so I've got my physical senses. I can see, I can taste, I can touch, I can smell, and I can hear things. And because of that, I can navigate through physical space. I can see there's a door there. I can walk towards the door. If I miss the door and I hit the wall, I feel that, I hear it, like all of this stuff. And it helps me navigate physical space. Emotions do the same thing for relationships and situations.
Hmm.
And so if I'm constantly pushing these shoulds on myself, I should be something other than I am. Most people will have an emotional response to that, where it's anxiety because I feel like I'm worried, whether that's depression because I feel like I should do that, but there's a part of me saying, I'm not giving you the energy to do that because you've got to stop chasing infinity because you're exhausted. And there's these things that'll come up naturally where these things will look at it as symptoms what are really actually trying to communicate to us. Now, there are times where symptoms are very much symptoms and whatnot, but I also believe in this term that's called psychic determinism. And what that means is that aside from substances that alter the way that we perceive and filter things, or degenerative disorders, so if there's damage to the actual neurological structure of the brain or traumatic injuries to the brain, if any of those happen, a little bit different, but in almost every other situation, symptoms try to accomplish something. And it really changes the way that we look at this. And so when we look at things like how we respond to situations, we need to understand what is the symptom trying to do. So a good example is a fever. We get an infection, our body is going to strike a fever. Now, the fever is try to go ahead and help us fight off the infection and make the body less hospitable and see what we can do to move towards healing. If it's out of control, it can actually cause damage to ourselves. We want to watch it. But the fever itself isn't necessarily bad because it's trying to do something. We just want to go
Doesn't
ahead and
feel
end
good.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
that's it.
And so same thing like with a cough, like we're trying to expel things from our airways and move things out. Now we then take cough suppressants and all this other stuff and it changes in our so we don't cough it out and we keep it in. We spend a lot of time sometimes chasing symptoms to be comfortable. And sometimes that's perfectly fine because maybe people need that comfort or maybe the symptom is too intense and it's actually doing more harm than good. But we've chased comfort so much that sometimes we don't tolerate any type of symptom that is actually functioning. And so this goes back to that saying about emotions is that if we don't tolerate feeling bad and we think, okay, I need to be happy all the time, we're ignoring what something like sadness is actually telling us and what melancholy is telling us and what it is to try to help us understand the situation. And so the idea of like what does mentally healthy and mentally well people look like, it doesn't mean that we don't have emotions and it doesn't mean that we don't have good days or bad days. It means that we're able to take that to better understand ourselves and say, okay, how do I want to engage in life? How do I want to move forward? Is it too intense that I need help? Or am I at a place where it's helping me better understand myself and I can make decisions? And that doesn't have to actually be mutually exclusive because there's a lot of people that are in a good place of mental wellness that can also still benefit from therapy because you can still then understand yourself better and be better informed and listen to those cues better. And it's kind of the same way as like, okay, I'm in a room and I'm feeling a little bit cold. I'm going to put on a sweater. We can start getting to that place where that's non-judgmental. It's not like we're saying, oh, I shouldn't have been cold or oh, this is so bad. But instead, we're just saying, okay, this is the cue and this is the action. And the same thing can happen with our emotions. Okay, I'm feeling a little sad here. What's going on here? A lot of times it's telling me that I'm putting energy into something and part of me is saying slow down. Or there's anger. There's an expectation or a boundary that's been violated. And so I'm upset because I thought I could trust something, or rage. I feel danger and I'm trying to protect myself or get out of here. And, we can learn what these emotions are telling us so that we can then make better decisions about those relationships and situations. But to numb ourselves from it or disconnect ourselves from it causes issues.
Yeah, this is beautiful, man. I'm really happy I get to talk to you again. because I've gotten to this place in meditation similar, or where I feel like there's a driver, right? Or I've heard someone explain it once in a book that you're not your thoughts, you're the one who watches them, kind of an idea.
Mhm.
And that broke my brain for a year when I'm like, all right, what is that then? And then who's watching that? You know, and you kind of this weird thing happens. But I got to a point and where I felt like I'm in a car. I'm in this like fleshy meat vehicle that's driving around through the earth, and that I have emotions and I have this logistical side. And I'm not either of those. Like it's part of the vehicle, but if
Yeah,
I don't understand how they work, and I'm in a Tesla, it's going to drive wherever it wants to go, and then I don't get to choose anymore, right? I'm at its mercy. And so it sounds like, and if I'm not putting words in your mouth, is that you're trying just to help people learn how your emotions and the logistical side of your brain works based on maybe what the driver really wants so they can navigate that easier. Is that kind of what you're
yeah.
saying? And
And part
I'm
of,
trying to Sesame Street it a little bit.
if we let Sesame Street it, I think that's
Yeah.
a phenomenal way
All
of saying.
right.
But it is. It's like saying, I want to be able to navigate life so that I can live the life that I want to. And part of it is, how do I know if I'm living the life I want to?
And that's that
Well,
awareness piece, right?
it's an awareness
Yeah.
piece, and emotions are part of that just as much as like these are my thoughts and ideas. Like we're going to have emotions that are tied to that. And so being able to be okay with our emotions and not put judgment on them, say, I should not feel X emotion. That's like saying I should not feel cold ever, or I should not feel heat. Like it's going to happen if something's there that's causing you to feel cold or feel heat, and we can't be afraid of these emotions. We have to learn to, how do we manage them? And no, we don't want to be overwhelmed by them. And part of where that goes is we can have emotions about the emotion. So
Mm.
I'm sad because I feel sad, and then we have to kind of trace it back to say, okay, so then what started this cascade?
Yeah.
And where is it? Because that's where the shoulds come in. Well, I'm sad because I'm sad. Well, why are you sad? Because you're sad. Well, I'm sad because I shouldn't feel sad. I should be happy. And it's like, okay, so we're addressing that part, but we're not getting back to like what started the cascade where you
Right.
were sad to begin with. And sometimes we get too fixated on that. I shouldn't be sad. I should be happy. That we don't dig deeper to say, what started this? How am I not chasing the emotion about the emotion, but really what was the cue that my body or my psyche was trying to tell me?
Yeah. I'm so happy we're talking about this because I don't know if you remember, but before we did the podcast, we had a conversation like on the phone, and I was
Yep.
trying to explain what I was going to do with this mission. And for people, I can't remember if I've talked about this in podcast yet, but I told you I was going to go see, I was going to get brain scans and I was going to do blood work and I was going to do all these
Yes.
things to find depression in my mind and my body. And then I was going to talk to people like you, do the things they recommend, and then see if things are changing. And I spent 2 years making this huge plan and how to financially get it to work. And then within 5 minutes you go, oh, you're not going to find anything. You're going to find, because depression is just a collection of symptoms, and that's all it is. And that kind of broke in a good way. It took 20 years for someone to say that to me, instead of a lot of doctors giving me prescriptions and meds and try breathing, try doing this, and they were doing things to help me feel better. But I'm always been a guy who's like, just tell me where the root is and I will go dig down to get it. I've always been wired that way. And you helped me do that to the point where I did the podcast and it took me a year to put it out because I was like, I don't have a plan anymore. You just, I'm not going to be getting any brain scans or blood work done. But it started my mission on going, instead of having this huge emotion and then running away from it and going, how do I stop this? This is bad. I've been told depression's bad and you have this, and people are, and then you get messages from society. If you feel this way, people like happy people and you're not a happy person right now. So the cycle continues. So what happened is I started doing these meditating things, or when I'd feel this big emotion, I used it as a fire alarm to go, all right, let's see where this is coming from. Let's, like you described with the cough,
Yep.
this isn't bad. This sadness or this feeling isn't bad. I have it for a reason. And then I started welcoming them instead of trying to push them away. And that's where my life completely started to change. And so, part of me wanting to do a podcast again was to thank you for that, because that was one of the best things anyone has ever given me, is just to
destroy my plan into a million pieces right off the bat.
Was not my intention. I
No,
mean,
I know. I'm saying it as a joke, but as we're talking about this stuff now, and I've always heard it and I've read it that all emotions are equal, and it took me that tweak of, oh, these are just
yeah,
symptoms. And as I've been trying to tell other people that it's hard for them to wrap their head around that. Oh, these are just symptoms. These are, and they're okay to have. They're good, but we're not taught that all the time, and that makes it hard.
exactly. And so there's been value that's been placed on emotions or not having emotions or being stoic and being able to work through it. Now, I should put one caveat out there is that we have found there's multiple pathways towards depression. And with some stuff, inflammation is playing a key, and we can see some of that stuff. And there's also cortisol levels or stress levels and whatnot, and our body will respond to it. But to say I'm going to look for one physical marker that's going to tell when everybody has depression. We're not there yet. And so, um, but again, and that's where, as we talked before, any mental health diagnosis right now, for the most part, is just a collection of symptoms that we group together. And every couple of years, with different iterations of the DSM and whatnot, we decide which symptoms make sense to loop together statistically, which ones load together, and which ones, make sense because we see them more together as a constellation. And sometimes things change and whatnot over time as our understanding changes. And so chasing that pure, like, this is what this diagnosis is and what it means and the whatnot, most of these mental health diagnoses don't have that.
Okay.
Some of them are starting. I mean, within the last year or so, there are some people out there with that are starting to find blood markers for bipolar and whatnot disorder, but it's
Wow.
it's more like the markers and whatnot. But what we're what you're saying though is really the key to it is that we've spent so much time trying to keep emotions and whatnot at arm's distance. A lot of people have, and thinking this is what I need to be like, and this is how I should be. I need to be happy. That what you said there, you're not happy, and people like happy people, and this and that.
Yeah.
It creates this sense of isolation, and like we have to suffer in silence, and that's dangerous. And when we start thinking about how most of us do better in social situations, we talked about connection with your therapist as being a predictor of outcomes. Another big one is social support. What's the quality of your relationships with others? And so when we think back to psychic determinism, what's going on from an adaptive point of view that's going on with depression? So if we go and we say, let's do the um, stress diathesis model of depression anxiety. And so what that is we've got stress levels, cortisol levels. And what happens is stress, when we think about this, is an indicator of change. A little bit of stress lets us know, hey, something's going on. A lot of stress, we can hit a threshold where we cross that line, and suddenly our body is going into, I need instinctually to respond to protect myself. And so a little bit of stress comes on, like I'm hungry. Something, and here stress is a signifier of change. Something is changing, something needs to change. I want something to change. Hunger, I need food. So a little bit of stress comes up. I know then to respond to my environment, go find food. And so that tells me that cue. If I was completely a stress-free life, I wouldn't respond to that. I would not know that I'm hungry, and I would not know to go get that. So stress plays an important part. Now, everybody has a threshold, and this also comes back to this idea of what's mental health and wellness, is that our threshold level is, some of us, it's set just like kind of how far can most people naturally run. I may be able to run 1 mile or 10 miles or whatnot
Mm.
naturally, but with training and with other experiences in life, that may go up. If I get an injury, it may drop down. If I continue to train and I continue to push myself, it may become greater, a more larger amount of stress that I can handle. And so there's all these individualized factors that happen that determine how much stress I can handle before I cross that line to where the body says, okay, I've got to respond. And so if stress kind of crosses that line, like let's say I'm out on a hike and there's a bear, my stress levels are going to go high. It's going to release a lot of cortisol. And once it crosses that threshold, my body's going to kick into fight, flight, freeze, or to try to seek control. And so I'm either going to run from the bear, I'm going to fight the bear, I'm going to freeze and whatnot. And all of these are pretty primal adaptive responses. running from a threat makes sense. Fighting the threat if you can't get away, it in our mind makes sense. Not always in every situation for both of those, but like makes sense. And then freeze. Like if you get lost in the woods, the idea of just conserve your energy, stay put, and wait for help. It's this mentality of like wait it out and hope that the threat passes. And so when we're in that threshold, it's meant for a momentary issue. If I'm coming across a threat while I'm hiking and whatnot, and there's a wild animal, that's momentary. That's a 10, 15-minute, half hour issue. That's how our bodies are perfectly well adapted to respond. But we can have compounding long-term stressors. I've got, rent or mortgage to pay. I've got, things due for work. I've got other bills. I've got to do this. There's expectations, shoulds. All that other stuff can be compounding stressors that push me over that threshold level.
Mm.
And if I'm constantly over that threshold level, my body's long-term trying to respond in that fight, flight, or freeze or seeking control mentality. If I'm constantly in that flight mode, it's a lot of the symptoms of anxiety. I'm looking for how to escape. What do I do? Where's the threat coming from? How to be prepared? If it's in that mentality for long term, it goes to freeze. It's like a lot of symptoms of depression. Conserve energy, wait for help. Sometimes we'll have a natural instinct to cry, which is typically a signal to other people that we need help, which is why when you see somebody crying, people, it's hard not to have a curiosity and what's going on and whatnot. We instinctually typically have that response where we want to see what's happening. So we also instinctively tend to have that response of when I need help and I'm overwhelmed, I'm going to cry because that's my signal to try to say, hey, anybody
help.
around?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
Like I need a little support. And so, or irritability with the fight and all that other stuff. And so anybody that has long-term chronic stressors will be pushed into that place where they have fight, flight, or freeze as their initial response. And there's another kind of ceiling on top of that. When you cross that, the body goes, okay, enough with the instinctual response. I'm just going to release a bunch of adrenaline and you're going to, get out of there typically. And that's what a panic attack is that your body releases a bunch of adrenaline and it takes about 20 minutes to metabolize typically. And unless we're then panicked about the panic attack and then, we release more adrenaline and whatnot. But for most people, that's where that panic attack kicks in. So when we look at all of this, the question ends up being, is having that response a mental health issue, or is it response to the stressors of life? Is it a response to everything else? And then how do we go ahead and manage that?
Well, it
Well,
sounds like it can be sorry to butt in, but
yeah,
it sounds like it can be a mental health issue if you let it go on for so long that it becomes so big you can't manage it anymore, right?
exactly. And if we
Okay.
don't have the resources or the support, or we're not in a situation where we have things to help us get under. So let's say I'm chronically at a place where I can't afford a place to live and my stressor is chronically high. It's not like necessarily like saying I'm going to probably have feelings of depression and anxiety and whatnot because where I'm going to live, what I'm going to do and whatnot. Then if
Right.
that's something
Which is
that,
natural and normal.
yeah,
But
actually normal, your
just to let
brain,
people listen to this, like that's totally okay to feel that way if you're in that
it is.
situation. It's a tough situation. Yeah.
Yeah, your brain is actually doing what it's supposed to, is that it's trying to then solve for it. Unfortunately, that natural instinct is not necessarily adapted to the society that we're in now because, before our threats are, it's still thinking, even a couple hundred years ago, it's going to be more common where, all right, something, a wild animal or something else is going on, run or fight or freeze. It's not the best response for how do I pay for a place to stay tonight is to run or to just shut down and freeze. Like it's still trying to help, but it's not adapted to the societal thing. So we look at, what are the other support systems out there to help? And this is why social supports are so important for mental health, because if we're in that place that we're constantly not able to address those stressors, it's going to continuously put us in a place where our natural physiological response is going to be to push towards depression, anxiety, and whatnot.
So what would
So
you like to see change though? Because it sounds like if society's creating a lot of these things for us, because we don't fit the mold, right, yet, or do we adapt to society? Or I know they're both kind of fluid and they could grow together, but do you see that happening, or think because I've seen some mental health numbers, you've probably seen current ones, but it doesn't seem like mental health is getting better. It seems like it's slowly getting worse over time. So that's
It,
concerning.
it is. So this is where it's also a little bit tricky with those numbers and whatnot, because you're right. If you look at like reported cases and everything else, the question is it greater now because more people recognize it and are reporting
Mm,
it, or is it greater because it's actually happening more? And this is where there's a lot of debate in the community to say, okay, are things getting worse? Or are they getting better? And whatnot. The crux of it is that if we know better, so even if it is that there's more mental health issues or that we just are more aware of them, the bottom line is that there's still some type of push to say, so what do we do about it? Regardless of what it is, if we know this number of
yeah,
people are struggling with it, how do we help it? And this is where different types of programs and different types of supports are important,
gotcha.
because we have to make resources accessible. We have to think about what are the barriers to care, what are stopping people from getting the support and the help they need, and what's the overall ecosystem that are driving these types of situations where people are going to be more likely to be depressed, anxious, and have different types of struggles. The same way that we would look at any other public health issue to say, what's the larger ecosystem that's creating the higher likelihood for these types of symptoms to emerge? And that's where we need to be more creative about how do we give different types of programs and different types of supports, and think about like the individual needs of individuals, um, to give them care that matches what's going on for them.
Yeah.
And this is where, when you have kind of numbers like this can be, the instinct can be like, okay, I need something scalable, repeatable, predictable, and everything else, so that we can mass produce it, get it out there, and suddenly everybody's got their standard issue, like here's your mental health program. And it can be very easy with the healthcare system to think that way, because we want to make it scalable and like cost effective, because it is, you got to think about those resources. The issue with doing that is that it can become more about the idea of numbers and scale than
Oh.
thinking of the individual person.
So it's back to what you were talking about with the clinician working with the client, right? Yeah. So the system is working as the clinician trying to save the world at that point, right?
Exactly.
It's about the program instead of the client. I got you.
And
Okay.
so this is where we see that ecosystem just kind of repeat itself. And we've got to make sure that we're thinking about like what are the actual factors and the individual need. So we've got to fight, not fight, I think that's too strong of a word, but we have to resist the urge to go for a reductionistic idea of how to support mental health. There's no one size fits all, and there's no, because and this is the big danger that we also run into, is dominant culture has also gone ahead and dictate a lot of what comes out for mental health, in terms of, a lot of times historically people from the dominant culture have been the people that have been saying, here are the programs that are out there. We need to make sure that we have other voices, other stories being told and understood, to make programs that fit those needs. One of the things that is shocking when we start thinking about it is that a lot of the tools that are out there for addressing suicidality, for instance, are have been historically normed on dominant culture responses. It's been, and so when you've got other cultural expressions of suicidality, a lot of the major tools that are out there aren't honed necessarily to pick that up and to recognize it and to give clinicians the right tools to address it. One of the things that I ran into, and this is beyond suicidality, is just language. I was doing neuropsych assessments, and we ran into a question that was based off of an idiom within the dominant culture of "I'm feeling blue." And what had happened is I was working with a translator, and they were translating it into a different dialect of Hmong. And what the translator shared is there's no direct idiom translation for this. So every time I'm doing this, I'm making up a different interpretation of that word. Is
Yeah.
that something important for me to tell you? and when we're looking at like trying to say, okay, we have this this instrument that we're saying is standardized and has been normed in different populations, and we're thinking about like, okay, there are questions that are sometimes being interpreted completely different because we hadn't thought about the different cultural implications. That becomes a problem, because then I'm saying I'm using this tool to measure it, and is it actually measuring what I think it is? And so, we do have stuff in the field where we try to catch that, but there are things that get through, or things that we haven't caught. And then you don't necessarily realize, if you're not taking the time to then slow down and say, are we actually matching the individual with the care that they need?
Right. Yeah, that makes it hard. I keep reverting back to, can we, is there a way to get tools into people's hands sooner? Like I always, I, and again, I'm just a guy in my room talking to people like you, but if there was a way, and there probably already is programs to give this to elementary school kids. I know they, instead of timeouts and things, I've heard of, let's just do mindfulness practices instead. And so you're
Mhm.
kind of teaching these skills early on. And I guess in my head, I see it going, well, then they have the skill. So if something happens down the road where they're feeling a big emotion in a different space, they can take those breaths, and they can, at least start in a healthier way than maybe my generation grew up, or the generation before me, where you just start crapping all over yourself and shooting
Well,
yourself to death, like you said.
and this is where the issue comes in, is that if people are punished for having big emotions, then big emotions equal bad and equal
Right.
like, okay, so then I have to contain it or hide it or whatnot. And when you bottle up emotions, what happens? They they get louder and louder and louder until they're even harder to contain. And so, when what you're talking about is like, how do you go further upstream and say, how do we give them people tools from the very beginning? That's really where there's more emphasis, and luckily we're starting to see that. We're starting to see how things are coming into elementary schools and school age kids, where there's those emphasis of how do we create more psychological health awareness and wellness. And you've got other programs and approaches that are out there. And so, aside from doing clinical work, I'm with a healthcare technology company. And one of the things that we're doing is really creating tools that address how do you go through and learn about mental health, and those tools that help self-manage it, as well as be aware of when it's getting to a place where you should be engaging with clinical care. And the
Yeah.
goal isn't to say let's replace the clinician. It's not doing that. It's recognizing that gap. And there's other people out there doing similar stuff, and this is where technology and the different ways that we communicate stuff can help remove those barriers to access, give people more tools, more supports, more options, so that they can address what it is that they're feeling and help manage it. And then know, like, okay, now it's time for me to raise my hand or go find somebody to
Yeah.
talk to.
That makes sense. So like I was a professional pole vaulter, and we the elite pole vaulters kind of work that way. You check in with your coach maybe once a month, but
Yep.
they give you the program, the tools to do on your own. And if they run into issues, there's always an open line of communication. Is that sort of the approach you guys are thinking? Like, here's the information, here's the tools. When you need help, we're here. But without this, we're bogged down with our mental health system, and we're burning out, and it's not sustainable. So we need to figure out how to give you guys some homework, I guess you can do at home to work on
Exactly.
this without us.
How do you give people resources before it's at the point where they need to really raise their head and get in? So then they're suddenly met with 3 to 6 months of wait where it's
Right.
not matching it. And so, how do you help make it more accessible and more encouraging, and removing that stigma about it, to say, okay, let's just become more savvy about our mental health and mental wellness and overall wellness. And how do we go ahead and do things that are going to support that, and then learn about the key term that's in the field right now, is that resilience. So,
Yeah.
when we go back to that idea of that stress level, and how, like, training, you can go ahead and build it. There are things like resilience training where you can go to a place where it's like, how do you get to a stressor in life, and then if it doesn't go too far over, you manage it. Now you've actually made it so you can deal with more stress. A lot of times what you see, this is like when kids go to school, is a good example. First day of school, stressful, overwhelming. Last day of school, it's kind of like, okay, I know what to expect. I'm there. And it's not that big of a deal now. It's like, I want to move on. Um, and the way that the brain adapts isn't that much different than a muscular system. So like when we go ahead and if I can normally walk 3 miles and I stay at 3 miles or I walk 2 miles, no big deal. My stress level hasn't crossed that threshold. But if I suddenly try to walk 10 miles, I'm going to be really sore. And it's like the next couple of days, I'm not going to be able to go my normal 3 miles. I
Right.
might be able to go a mile or a half a mile, or I might, really struggle with even that. Same thing happens with us with mental health. If we get to a place where we're really pushed and where our stress levels are really high and those symptoms are really strong, our threshold of what we can tolerate goes low. So now, if I'm really depressed and anxious, it might not take a lot more to get me back to that anxious state because I haven't had time to give myself time to rest to recover. The same way I need time to rest and recover from if I walk too far. Now,
Right.
if instead I go ahead and I'm walking 3 miles and the next time I'm doing 3 1/4 and I stay there for a little bit, and then I go ahead and now suddenly 3 1/4 is my threshold of what I can do, and then now I'm 3 1/2, and I slowly build up, I can increase my stamina, my ability of how much I can tolerate. The same thing happens with us with stress. So it's not bad for us to be in slightly stressful situations that we're a little uncomfortable with, so long as we have the resources to manage it and to bring our stress level down below that threshold so that we feel like we've accomplished it and we succeeded.
It's got to be
And
healthy. Just choosing to put yourself in those situations too, right? Like, I know,
absolutely.
I got this idea from sports. Like, I'm gonna do this really hard workout. It's gonna be hard. My body's gonna adapt. And then I didn't think of it at the time until I really dove into mental health stuff. It was like my mind was adapting too. I was able to
Yes.
handle these stresses. And so for the last year and a half, I was taking a cold shower every morning.
Mhm.
Part of it was meditating just to see what my mind would do while I was in there, and it was just terrible. Like, it's not fun being in a cold shower. But then over time, it became easier, and I was like, I need to go longer, or I need to make it colder. Kind of the same idea. And I was noticing my stress to the cold was increasing. To now, like this morning, I have an ice tub in my garage, and I
Yeah.
jump in there, and it was frozen. I had to break the ice just to get into it. But the same idea. I've kind of used it that way, and to do that. Have do you have any other examples? I know I've used cold's my example, but what are other ways people can put themselves in semi-stressful situations to help with this resilience for when they're in a giant emotional situation, they'll be able to handle it?
Well, and when you're in a giant emotional situation, it's probably not the best time because you're already
Right.
like you walk 10 miles and
It's
now
like
you're
you
going to
need
say, okay,
training so you can
I'm going to
handle
ask
it.
to do a little bit. But it's more like when you're in a good spot, this is where you start thinking about like, okay, what am I interested in? And so Joseph Campbell would always say, like, follow your bliss, like find something that you're actually interested in or that you are motivated in, because that makes it a lot easier. If it's, I want to improve physically, that there is a mental tax that comes along with it, that stress that we manage, and then we feel a sense of accomplishment. Or maybe it's like I want to learn something new, or I'm a little bit uncomfortable going out in social situations, but I want to have better relationships, and so I'm going to go ahead and push myself to maybe not say no next time I'm invited to go out, and kind of do that where it's not I'm jumping into the deep end and I'm going to
Right.
overwhelm
Correct.
myself. But it's like those small incremental steps. And what happens is we become more and more comfortable with it. It's the same idea, like if people have a common fear or struggle that they have is talking in public. And so it's like, can you join something where you learn speech? You do, kind of get an opportunity like Toastmasters or whatnot. You eventually get to a place where you're able to speak in front of people. It's just building that tolerance. And if you know this is why I'm doing it, is to help push myself a little bit to then increase my stress level and tolerance, it starts becoming more broad and our overall stress levels start increasing. But again, we got to watch it so that we don't overdo it, because that's the danger. And so if we say, okay, I've done, I can normally do 3, I'm going to push myself to 5 miles, and then I'm going to do another 2 mile walk after that, like we've overshot it, and we're going to be at that other place. Then the shoulds kick in, and well, now I should do 3 again, and I should do 3 again. We're not listening to our body, and what
Yeah,
happens is we lower our overall tolerance, and instead of increasing resilience, we've gone ahead and set back. So it's really about those incremental small steps, and then feeling a sense of accomplishment with it.
that makes sense. I just love how if it's just, it makes me smile inside when you start thinking about it like social situation training, right? So
Yep.
even if it's again, because I would avoid talking to a girl when I was in high school, right? Because it was scary.
Yep.
But you're like, I'm going to do some training instead and go and just see how this goes. And I might bump into a wall, but that's okay because that's part of training, and you do better next time.
Exactly.
It's a growth mindset kind of an idea at that point. But I got two more questions for you because I don't want
Yep.
to run out of time. But so the first one, I've had this for a long time, but everyone talks about processing trauma. What happens with trauma? Where does it go? I'm reading a really good book right now called The Body Keeps the Score, which might answer a lot of
Yep.
these questions. But figured I'd ask you instead. Um, so what is processing trauma? Like what happens in your brain? And I've also heard it gets stored in your body tissue. People have sent me, or I've seen images of animals when they like get a lot of energy and they kind of shake it out, and that's kind of their way of processing. I don't even know if that's accurate or not. But so what's going on? Like how not how can people do this, but how is the body able to navigate this system?
So this gets really tricky because with trauma, I'm just going to go ahead and put this out here at first.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about trauma, but when somebody goes through their own trauma processing, it has to be unique to them, and it has to be at a pace that makes sense to them. When we start going back and thinking about, hold on, psychic determinism, this idea that I've talked about before, symptoms have a purpose. As hard as it may be for some people to believe, the symptoms of trauma have a purpose. And what it's trying to do is it's in essence saying, what have I experienced was so bad, I never want to feel that way again. And so in a situation, we often get a couple of things that happen. One, we tend to have what we call a flashbulb memory. So normally I'm taking in all of this information around me. My brain, through the reticulating activating system, the RAS, I can go ahead and filter out about 80% of it so I can focus on something. So that way I'm not constantly thinking about like, how do my feet feel in my socks, and what are the different noises out there and like whatnot. I can focus and have this conversation. And so about 80% of sensory perceptual data is filtered out. That's why we can drive home the same way or kind of walk the same path. And one day we notice something, it's always been there that we hadn't seen before. It's because
Yeah.
before it was part of that 80% that was filtered out for most of us. And so when a traumatic event happens, a couple of key things happen in the brain. One, we tend to encode all of that information. And so instead of that 20%, pretty much 100% of that gets encoded. And then two, our brain makes a decision, I never want to be in a situation like this again.
That makes
And
so.
so,
Is this an accurate way to describe it? I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off. I'm just trying to
oh
make sure
no,
I'm on the same page. So I've described it or thought of it like a snowy hill, right? And you have this neural pathway, and if you sled down the hill, you get a deep groove, or you get a groove. And a traumatic experience is like dropping a beam into the groove, where it just makes the groove really, 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 really deep. Like it just
yep,
implanted into the snow, just like it would into your brain, like traumatically.
yeah,
But on the other side, I've also was like, but you can also go over that same groove 100 times, even if it's not a beam, and get just as deep, which can create some kind of traumatic response in there too. Is that kind of an accurate way of thinking about how this works?
100%. And
Okay.
that's the difference between what we call compounding trauma, which is where you have traumatic events that repeat itself. And sometimes people call this big T trauma versus little t trauma, where it's
Okay.
maybe one giant event or multiple other events that add up to being a traumatic event and traumatic experience.
Okay.
Um, and so that's actually a really good way of thinking about it. And so what happens if we're talking kind of the big traumatic event? The same thing can happen with these smaller ones, as our brain will take this, what we call flashbulb memory, and it'll encode all of the information about it. And what happens there is that the brain is convinced that on some level, one of those things that's in our environment should have predicted that something bad was about to happen. We like to
Mm.
believe in cause and effect. So it'll start going, if I'm outside, what's the color of the sky? What's the temperature? What does the grass or the snow look like? And it's encoding all of that information to try to think, what was the predictor that I might have missed?
So is it just trying to prevent it from happening again at that point, right? By looking through the massive amount of data that it just collected.
Yes.
Okay.
And so then what happens from there is that it creates this laundry list. And then it starts from there, it's holding on to that list and we'll start comparing it with current events. Okay, am I in a similar place? Okay, is the sky the same color? Is the grass the same color? And the more those boxes line up, the more stress I'm going to feel, the more activated I'm going to feel until my body gets to a point where I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling anxious, I want to leave. And then it can hit to that higher level where I'm going to go into a flashback because my body's going to say, let me remind you what you're avoiding. And it's trying to scare you to get out of that situation and to be on guard. So it's trying to protect you psychologically. Or sometimes what we get is disassociation, which is like suddenly we're watching somebody rather than experiencing it ourselves. It's like we're watching somebody going through the events. And the brain's trying to do that because it's like if I disassociate, if I look like I'm watching a movie, it's not going to affect me the same way as if I'm experiencing it. So maybe that groove that we just talked about isn't as deep from this event that might be about to happen.
So what's it called if you don't have it at all? Because I've heard of people like, not remembering their childhood, or and that's just
Mhm.
is that the brain trying to protect itself from just any of it? Like I'm going to delete all this
Anyway,
information,
with
or
this association, I'm going to go ahead and try to block out that memory so I'm not affected by it. And so,
okay,
when we start thinking about consciousness, what happens is it almost becomes like tree branches. And so the thing that happens with the traumatic event is that it's not typically just the event. It's the event happens and then a tree branch comes off because now it's me talking about the trauma and then now it's me having a flashback and now it's me having symptoms because of it. And so before you know it, you have this spider web effect where, if we say here's the event in the middle, all of these other subsequent events are now traced back to the traumatic event. So when we start doing that, we can start getting this ever expanding spider web neurologically, where all these different memories and experiences happen. Physiologically, we have different types of stress hormones and experiences that we have that get stored in the body and that we then feel and that happens. And any of these things become triggers. And so we start, and then on top of that, since psychologically we have what's called a reflexive system, we can have top down or bottom up symptoms where top down is I think something is happening, and then I start physically feeling it. We see this sometimes with chronic pain. Sometimes there's genuinely causes of pain, and sometimes it's I anticipate I'm going to be in pain, and so I start manifesting it and feeling it. Doesn't mean that pain is any less real, but we may look at it and not be able to find a physical cause of it, but our belief is that I'm feeling the pain and so I continue to experience it. And what we're finding sometimes with chronic pain is that actually talk therapy can actually be very beneficial to reduce overall pain. You're not physically changing anything with the nerve structure or anything like that, but our belief about it changes and the pain subsides.
mm.
And then we can have what's called bottom up, which is where there is something physically happening. There is damage there. The pain, the nerve is, hurt or whatnot. And then because of that, it's affecting the way that I think and feel about it. So with all of this going on, our brain is working to try to prevent us from experiencing another trauma. And so these symptoms come up and the danger is when we say processing the trauma, and like the trauma story, a lot of times clinicians, some clinicians, and then people in general sometimes get this belief either from movies or other things that the way to process it and get it out is that you've got to tell the trauma story. And this is where the danger comes in
Oh,
is
that can
that,
make it worse then, right? As you just
yeah,
described. Yeah.
because if we think about that spider web of all of these events, I go ahead and I feel the need to tell the trauma story, and I haven't taken the time to address how do I manage my symptoms when I'm overwhelmed? How do I actually take off these different pieces that have been spiderwebbed and process? This is how trauma's made me feel, and this is how this is, and this is this. If I haven't separated the actual trauma event from all of these spider webs, these tentacles, these branches that have grown off of it, what I'm doing is I'm picking that up and everything else is coming with, and it's
Mm.
over. And so if we're working with, if you're working with a clinician and whatnot, a lot of times best practices are to go slow. How do we talk about all of these other stuffs around it before jumping in and saying, let's actually talk about the trauma? And so,
This is interesting. So it's kind of like the stressor thing we were talking about, right? So as a clinician, you want to slowly maybe allow them to be in a somewhat stressful situation talking about their past instead of just going, let's just talk about the rape or whatever happened, because that's just going to be too
It's
much, and then the resilience is low, and then it's
it's
over,
overwhelming.
right? Yeah, it's
And
overwhelming.
the danger is that when a clinician, and you sometimes see this with newer clinicians or people that haven't been trained in how to process trauma, and that's one of the things is that if you are looking to process trauma with a clinician, look to see that they've actually had training in trauma, because that's a big thing. And that just because you're a clinician doesn't mean that you're trained to treat everything. And so when you start looking at trauma, sometimes the danger is that clinicians have had experiences in themselves. Some people have gone through their own trauma, and that's what makes them want to be clinicians. And other people have had other experiences, other clinicians have experience with other patients where maybe telling that story was beneficial to that one patient. And if people start not, start thinking about that over the individual that's sitting in front of them, they're trying to make themselves the star of the show again rather than the side thing. And look at me, they trusted me so much that they opened up and I got them to share their trauma story. And I was working with students, and I had one student that was actually, oh, I really wanted to get this person to trust me so much that they shared the trauma story. And it's like, wait, right there. You want them to trust you. It's not about them anymore. It's about you trying to be validated as a clinician. And unfortunately, that can sometimes be a driver for people. And so we've got
Hmm.
to watch that so that people don't overwhelm them, because then physically, emotionally, psychologically, you're overwhelmed. You don't have the tools to cope with it. There are certain approaches. In some cases, there's a psychological approach called DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. And depending on people's trauma, it may be appropriate for people to do almost a year of DBT, which is different skills to manage intense emotions and feelings, depending on that person's situation. For some people, they may do DBT for a little bit of time or a year before they even get to a place of saying, let's address the trauma. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody has to spend a year doing that or that DBT is right for everybody, but it's just an example of like, this is how we want to be mindful of what's the individual's need before we go ahead and jump in and say, now it's time for you to share the trauma experience.
It's really interesting because we talked last time. I've been really curious and interested in how the psychedelics are processing this, and when I look at the research on MDMA, they say it's similar to what you're talking about. What MDMA seems to do is take out the physical reactions or symptoms that you have by looking at the experience. So it's not, if I'm using the groove analogy, it's not adding a deeper groove, and you're able to look at it without the emotions. So it's easier to process in a way, or that's what they think is happening right now, which could lead to maybe people getting better a little quicker if instead of having to do a year-long process of learning how to navigate their emotions that way. I'm not saying they shouldn't do that, because then when they're not on MDMA, they're going to want that tool in the first place.
But this is what, and I think what you're hinting at is that people are trying to find different ways of how does somebody not get overwhelmed when processing it. And
Right.
when you feel the way that I always talk about with clients, whether if somebody was looking at psychedelics or if they're looking at talk therapy, when I talk about it with talk therapy, I talk about a scale. And so you're dealing with a scale. And on one side, you've got the traumatic event and all the things that are spiderweb. These are all different boxes that have been put on this side of the scale. This is weight over here.
Yeah.
If I can pick up one piece of that and talk with you and you feel neutral or positive, like that was actually a good experience, I
Mm.
felt listened to and heard, that box moves to the other side of the scale. And what happens is we can start balancing it. Now, it doesn't mean that the traumatic event ever goes away, but it doesn't feel overwhelming and suddenly it's not connected to everything else. And we've moved enough over to the other side of the scale that it feels balanced and I can take this on now without feeling overwhelmed. When things like MDMA, it's trying to help with that process of moving it to the other side of the scale by helping remove somebody from that emotional experience. You can get that same effect with talk therapy if you feel connected and
There's
supported.
they're just all different tools to get to the same answer, right? And then I use this idea in coaching all the time. Like we for pole vaulting, we're just trying to create and transfer energy. When I've tried to break it down as simple as you can make it, like that's it. And everything else is just ways to do that based on your physical body, your mental, or where you're at logistically and how you understand the event. But that's it. We're just trying to create and transfer energy.
Just
Um,
trying to move it to the other side of the scale. And
that
the
makes
danger
sense. Yeah.
and the danger and the way that clinicians need to think about it and clients when they're working through it is that you're doing that to balance the scale. But if all of a sudden somebody says, you're pushing me too hard, or, this is not comfortable, and, the clinician is starting to, if they don't continue to check in and do that where the person feels empowered, the risk is that all of this good that's over here gets pushed back, and now suddenly you have another box. I tried
Mm.
talking, it didn't help. And then that becomes a box that's a pretty big box that, for a while, that was part of my specialty, is working with people that had tried trauma processing before and it had caused additional harm. And like, how do you recover from that and build trust with a clinician to then get back to a place where you feel comfortable moving the boxes over from one side to
And
the
that usually
scale?
just comes from progressing too quickly, like faster than the client's ready to, or is that all what the case
Yeah,
always to most support?
yeah.
Okay.
There's different type ways I can get there. Sometimes it is if the person's moved too quickly, or sometimes, unfortunately, there are going to be situations where, maybe a clinician retires and you're in the
Mm.
process of it and you don't get to fully finish it. And if the person they move to next, they don't have that connection to it, then they're like, okay, this isn't the right thing. And now if I'm processing my trauma experience and my clinician leaves, do I feel a sense of abandonment? Do I, and so there's
Right.
a lot of thought that goes into what happens when we have to either transfer clients for reasons of either retirement or other stuff, as well as like when you're in that process, how do you mitigate that so that there's not the likelihood of it slipping back?
So
It makes,
are we when you're trying to process moving things to different places, is this just having a different relationship with the experience? Is that what at its core, is that what just processing trauma is? It's just like, I had this experience, I was at this place at that time. I'm in a new place in life, or however you want to look at it. In time, I'm older, I'm wiser. I can look at this in a different way. I can see how it's affecting me, and I can see. So one example I'll share. I did this podcast with this lady who got in a traumatic car accident when she was 16, and half of her face got ripped off and she died, and now she's a stunt driver, if so she's doing great. But she couldn't figure out why, when she saw a waterfall for years, that she was having these panic attacks, and I gotta go, I gotta get away, I gotta get away. And it hit her like 10 years down the road that while she was in the car, um faces ripped off, blood everywhere, there was a fire hydrant that was going into the
oh,
car. And
yep,
it sounds like what you described earlier is that imprinting, if that's the right word, of all this data or information that was coming in while this crazy traumatic event was happening, the sound of water splashing just opened up that experience that she had. So she couldn't figure it out for the life of her until one day she goes, "Oh, there it is." And then she said from there she just started turning the faucet on, or she would have a shower, because she goes, I don't know why, she didn't even notice she was taking baths instead of showers after the experience too. you know but that awareness piece allowed her to go, oh, I don't have to be afraid of showers, I don't have to be afraid of waterfalls, I can start working my way to tip the
yep.
scale. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. That's moving the box because now you've realized, okay, this is where flashbacks and dreams. So the other thing that happens is our brain uses dreams sometimes as simulations. So if I have a dream about a traumatic event, and let's say, the sky was blue, I might have a dream where the sky is cloudy because the brain is saying, likely, if the same scenario happened but the sky was gray, do I think that that would have caused the same outcome?
Mm.
And if I go ahead and have that dream and something's a little different, my brain might say, okay, I'm convinced that I can drop the color of the sky off of that list of
Oh,
things.
that's interesting. I didn't
And
know that.
so, these dreams, they're traumatic and they're scary, but what it is that the brain trying to heal. And so, like with your example there, what it sounds like she discovered is that the brain was saying, okay, running water is a fear. And so she had to make a new relationship with running water to say, okay, in that situation, those were associated, but they weren't a cause. So I can be around other running water things and be comfortable with manage my stress. And then the brain says, okay, now I'm convinced that that's not a predictor of any type of
So that's
tragedy.
just
So
dropping that association and creating a new neuroplasticity, or
yes,
through neuroplasticity, so you can create new connections to other associations essentially at that point. Gotcha.
exactly. And
Okay.
leaking that one towards the trauma because we're saying, okay, now that connection isn't just associated with a trauma and it's not a predictor that more trauma is going to happen.
So when
And
people say this is stored in the body, does that just mean that that's the reaction you're having when you think back to this experience, or when you have this feeling in your body, that can do the top down versus the bottom up scenario that you're talking about?
Yeah, it can be both ways. And
Okay.
so what happens is, there's a couple of things that happen. Is first of all, stress and other types of hormones, some of them are fat soluble, and so they get stored like literally the same way that we get stored and whatnot. And so
Yeah.
there are things that happen there. But we also, in addition to all this other sensory data that we have, it's also our physical data. What are the feelings that I'm having in my body? How is my body functioning at this moment? Like that's part of, when we open the floodgates and we take every data point to say what's our predictor, what happens is that that's part of that data that the brain is saying, okay, is any one of those things the thing that was my cue that something bad was going to happen? And so then when we start going ahead and maybe reliving flashbacks, we can start re-experiencing some of those physical feelings. Or if later we have physical feelings that align with how we felt in that moment, those could be triggers that then suddenly say, ooh, time out. Are we at risk of being in that traumatic experience again? And so our connection with our physical body as a data point, kind of like the same thing if we said, I had a traumatic experience happen and the sky was blue, and then I see a blue sky, it's kind of like, uh-oh, is that the predictor that something bad's about to happen? And it's the same thing. Like if I had a sore shoulder when the trauma happened, and now my shoulder is sore, is that the predictor that something traumatic is going to happen? And so we make those physical connections of our body with the traumatic experience, and those can be triggers the same way any other type of cue can. And so we have to
Makes
process
sense.
that out. And what you talked about is actually a big strategy that sometimes people have when they go through a traumatic event and they need to convince themselves like, hey, I'm not in that flashback, I'm not reliving this, is to look at how am I different physically, how is my situation different now than it was then? I'm older, and sometimes, or things are different, I've got a different haircut, or there's whatever it is that we need to do to kind of anchor ourselves to the present moment so we don't get pulled into reliving that past experience.
Mm, that's fascinating. I have so many more questions, but I'll ask the last one here. First off, I have to thank you. This has been really a treat, and you're answering so many questions for me. I really appreciate it. The last one though, we were talking about earlier how well to find a good therapist, right? So what are a few questions that people can ask to make sure they're finding one that's a good fit for them? And we'll end on that because I think that's a question I get a lot, and I think that's a tough one for people to navigate.
So this is a really difficult question when you start thinking about the healthcare ecosystem and the shortage out there. Sometimes people feel pressure just to who's ever accepting somebody I should work with. But there are some really important questions to start. And the first are to start with yourself. So at different phases of life, we may be looking to connect with a different type of therapist. We may want somebody that is a similar age, or maybe we want somebody older, or maybe we want somebody younger, maybe we want somebody that has a similar gender identity or a different one. We may want somebody from, our same culture or our same race, ethnicity, or we may somebody that doesn't match. We need to start by asking ourselves just very seriously, what are we looking for? Who would I be more comfortable to opening up to? And that becomes an important thing, because if you don't feel comfortable working with your clinician, you're not going to have the same level of success. And then from there, if we have that, then a lot of times people go to the next thing, which is how do I afford it? Who's in network? Who's not in network?
Mm.
And that's an unfortunate reality of it. Not a lot of people have the economic freedom to just say, I'll go work with whoever. And then comes the other reality of like who's accepting patients or whatnot. Now, ways to go through this is when you start looking, there are databases out there. A lot of psychologists advertise in places like Psychology Today, APA, the American Psychological Association, has a directory where clinicians can post information about themselves. Insurance companies and healthcare plans typically have information about the different clinicians that they have available and what their specialty is. And that becomes the next thing, is that based off of what I'm looking for with somebody else, and it's okay if we don't know the answer to that, start reading the profiles of people that you're considering working with. How are they describing themselves? What do they say that they value? What do they say that's important to them? Because if we're just looking at like next available, it's okay, you might get the right person. Um, and it's helpful to then read like what is it about this person that I like?
Yeah.
Because somebody who's a good therapist for one person might not be the right match for somebody else. And so just
Right.
saying, okay, give me a recommendation and this person will be great isn't always going to be the best way to go about it.
So how long would you wait though if someone tries it to know if it's a good fit or not? Or how do you trust yourself in that process? You know, that's
Some people know within that first appointment and that
okay.
first session. And this is the thing is, and this is where we are, and for some people it takes 3, 4, 5 sessions before you really get the kind of the feel for it. And so it's not necessarily that you want to always go off of the first immediate impression, unless it's a bad impression. If you know like this is going to stop you from going again, ask for somebody else. And so you have to ask yourself, like, how much am I willing to put into it? But being able to say, feel comfortable with saying, hey, I would really like to try to find somebody that's a better match. Can you help me find another clinician? That is a very important thing for people to feel empowered to do, because when we start looking at the number of sessions most people go, there's a huge drop off where a lot of people don't go after that first appointment. And then there's another drop off at 5 or at 3, and then at 8 sessions. Now, 8 sessions, some people are starting to feel better and everything's, a lot of people might feel better or whatnot. But that 3, that 1 and that 3, those drop off points, a lot of times that's either therapy is not for me, or that therapist isn't for me, or that psychologist isn't for me. And those should be signs of, how do I ask for the right person?
Yeah.
And that as a clinician, they should be trained to help you, to say, okay, here are some other resources, or here's some other places you can try, or let me see if I know anybody at my, where I'm working or whatnot that I can try to get you in. What are you looking for? And there might not always, if there's a shortage, there might not always be an immediate here, you can transfer here. But then the question is, can I work with this person while I'm waiting to get into that other person?
Mhm.
Are they okay with it? Do I feel comfortable? The answer might be yes or no. You might say, actually, I'm just not matching with this person at all. I'd rather, try to find other types of resources to help for now.
Yeah.
But that's where we go back to that first appointment, and the setting the stage is so important to determine what happens everywhere else in that person's mental health wellness journey. And it's just important for clinicians to empower people to feel comfortable saying, hey, I'm looking for something a little different, can you help me? Rather than just saying, okay, this is it, I'm stuck with this person.
Perfect. I'm pumped. That I think that's going to help a lot of people with yeah, I get that question a lot. Like, how do I even know if I get a good one, or where do I even start? And it's like I'm just going to chop this little piece of video out and send it to them next time they have a question. No,
Well,
that's fantastic. Thank you.
I guess I'd add only one other thing to that too, is
Okay.
that there are different styles for therapy too. So you may find somebody that, okay, I like this person, I like their, how they write about themselves and everything else is good. Different people, different clinicians take different theoretical approaches and styles to how they do therapy. Some of them are going to be more, some of them call themselves eclectic and say, I'll do a little bit of everything. Some of them are going to be more theory based, where they say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and really focus on maybe their CBT, and they're going to focus on irrational thoughts and kind of the logical rational side, or maybe they're psychodynamic and they're looking at patterns and emotions and integrating that processing and whatnot. There's going to be different approaches that clinicians take, and it is okay to ask, what's your clinical approach, what's your theoretical approach, and then to decide after they've described it to you, is that one that you like, is that one that matches with how you want to engage in therapy.
Yeah, that's a good point. They teach that in the sporting field, and I keep bringing this back up because this was kind of how I found my back door into this a little bit, which was if I can. We were talking a little bit earlier that, this is the last thing I'll end on, which was how do we get this to kids sooner? And it was like,
Yep.
well, they're so worried about these performances all the time, or how to navigate these skills, and it was like, hey, well, these tools I learned, and I don't always tell them I learned them in a mental health hospital. It was like, I learned these tools that help me, in life, but they also help me perform better. So you give them mindfulness tools, you give them, body scan type things. You teach them how to regulate their emotions to help with their performance, and then they have these tools for the rest of their lives at that point. And that was kind of a way for me to go, oh, this is a cool way to try and get people interested in and find mental health cool, or these mental health teachings. And so as you're describing these tools, I'm going, it's the same thing as asking if this coach is good for me, right? Like,
Right.
are you an authoritative coach? Do you work with the team? What kind of skills or practices do you use? And so it's almost like looking at a therapist as a, I don't want to call him a life coach because that's a completely different thing, but someone to help you or coach you through these experiences that you've had or this place that you're at, and asking how they do that fits with different people. And yeah, just treat them almost like just an easy Sesame Streeting. And again, just ask your therapist like you're trying to find a new coach. Right? For yourself.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, and first of all, kudos for you for doing that, because it is important to give that to kids. They need those skills, and so that's great that you're doing that.
Well, you're doing that too, because I share these podcasts with all my pole vaulters too, or on social media and stuff. So you're doing the work, man. I'm just the messenger.
Messenger is important though, and so it's what gets it out there. So I really appreciate having this opportunity to come back again. This has been fantastic, and I appreciate.
Yes, same here. Thank you. We'll call it. I won't do a Minnesota goodbye this time. I'm pretty bad at those. But
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for having me again. I really appreciate it. This has been fantastic. And if you want me back in the future, keep me in mind.
I hope you found that helpful. I hope to talk to him again in the future. I learned so much, and my bucket feels so full after I talked to him. If you're wanting to help or you're looking for help, head over to owlmh.com, and there's things over there. And we're starting to launch these cool bracelets. This one says Inner Space Explorer on it. Kind of slick, right? And I got some other ones as ways to help with our mental health. So if you head over there, you can kind of see what that's all about. But that's how I'm trying to fund all of this while giving people tools to help with their mental health. That's been the plan all along. They've been helping me. And the bracelets came from a couple therapists. The bracelets idea have come from a couple therapists over the years that have used rubber bands and similar types of things. And I was like, yeah, I think I can make these a little cooler. But yeah, head over there. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.